Welcome to this Ofsted webinar. This is part of a broader range of materials which Ofsted released to support schools. This began in 2019 when we first launched the Education Inspection Framework and ran roadshows across the country to share our curriculum thinking. We recently revisited those principles and shared an abridged version of these 2019 roadshows to help make our messages as sticky as possible. You might also know that we've recently released research reviews for many areas of the curriculum, and our subject leads have also shared short videos that consider how pupils make progress and the implications for curriculum thinking. Following on from this, we've received a number of requests for us to speak at further national, regional and local events. But in order to make our subject insights as accessible as possible and to provide even more detail, we've compiled a new suite of webinars to support the sector. In today's webinar, we're going to look at history, but please do look out for further videos where the curriculum unit will cover other subject areas. Before we begin, it's important just to emphasise 2 points that I hope will be reassuring to those of you watching. Firstly, this video is structured in such a way that it's designed to be useful and accessible for teachers working across all phases of education and with all levels of specialism. Secondly, and most importantly, Ofsted doesn't expect the language or specific examples shared today to be replicated in schools. Instead, we hope that the subject-specific examples that I'll use in the video will just help to illustrate general principles about high-quality history education, and that you'll find these useful as you develop and refine the curriculum in your school, particularly given the challenges of the last 2 years. As our inspection handbook makes clear, schools have got the flexibility to choose their own curriculum approaches, as long as there's been sufficient thought given to its content, structure, sequencing, and implementation. The structure for this video is divided into 3 sessions. In the first session, we'll explore some of the subject-specific principles relating to curriculum and progression in history. In the second session, we'll consider some of the implications of these principles for practice in school, particularly focusing on pedagogy and assessment. And in the final session, we'll look briefly at how these principles might be implemented in a primary and a secondary setting. So let's start with session 1, looking at curriculum and progression in history. The first thing to establish is what we mean when we talk about curriculum intent. Now, one part of our curriculum intent in a school are our broad aims for what we want pupils to ultimately achieve, ultimately know and be able to do. But our curriculum is much more than just some general ambitions or long-term goals, and it's also much more than just a list of topics that we'll teach in history. The curriculum is also where we set out the journey of how pupils will end up achieving these ambitious endpoints. So this curriculum intent goes far beyond just a simple list of topics. It needs to make sure that we realise our ambitious aims and endpoints for all pupils. To give an example, one aim of our curriculum intent might be for pupils to develop broad chronological knowledge. But to realise this broad aim for all pupils, we need to be clear about exactly what it is we want pupils to know. We need to be clear about what we mean when we say broad chronological knowledge. This might be, for example, pupils being able to call up useful associations with a particular period, such as the broad features of the medieval period, if they hear the term. Or so that if they encounter a piece of medieval art or music, say, they understand some of the context. Now, this is likely to involve knowledge of some chronological markers, specific dates or events that allow pupils to understand connected developments, and also some broader period features, such as how people lived in a particular period or how government worked in a particular place during that period. But curriculum intent also goes beyond these aims and includes what we want pupils to know and remember within particular lessons, topics, and sequences of lessons. For example, we might want pupils to know about kingship, about how people lived in the Anglo-Saxon period, about how people travelled during the period. We might want them to remember the date of the end of the Roman occupation of Britain as a useful marker for before and after in their own mental timeline of the past. These specific ideas of what we might want pupils to know and remember as a result of what we teach them about the Anglo-Saxons are also part of our curriculum intent. They're our way of realising this broader and more long-term ambition to develop pupils' chronological knowledge by setting out clearly what pupils need to know and remember in individual lessons, topics, and sequences. Everything that we want pupils to know and be able to do is part of our curriculum intent in schools. It's also worth saying that a list of topics, which sometimes can be seen as the curriculum in a school, can also not be broad and ambitious on its own. To ensure that in our school we've got a broad and ambitious curriculum, we need to go beyond just looking at the curriculum as a list of topics and consider what's taught within these topics and what's learned and remembered by pupils across their time in school. Two different schools could teach the same topics, but have curriculums which vary greatly in their breadth and ambition. Now, as our research review recognised, making content choices in history, deciding what to teach, is really complex. Schools rightly have got significant freedom to construct a curriculum which is suitable for their pupils. But it's important for schools to think about the rationale for what is taught. And again, not just what broad topics are taught, but what is emphasised within particular topics. There are two really important rationales which often factor into history teachers' decisions about what to teach and emphasise. The first is ensuring a broad curriculum is taught to all pupils. Now, in history, our research review suggests four main ways in which schools might consider the breadth of the overall curriculum offer. First of all, pupils should learn about a breadth of historical periods. Our curriculum could be too narrow if it focuses too heavily on one period, say the 20th century, at the expense of pupils studying a broader range of periods. That could also be the case if pupils studied lots of 20th century history in primary school, and then again lots of 20th century history in secondary school, leaving them with limited knowledge of other periods. Pupils also need to learn about a range of places and societies in the past. The national curriculum also emphasises the importance of pupils knowing about the interconnectedness of places, people, and developments throughout history. For example, learning about places like Baghdad gives pupils a richer sense of the past, both through ensuring they learn about a range of places and societies, but also as an example of how developments at different places are closely connected through the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Pupils also need to learn about a range of people, groups, and experiences across the curriculum. They must understand the complexity and diversity of the past. Over time, they need to move away from simplistic or monolithic views about groups or their experiences. We also have to consider how the role of different groups is represented across our curriculum. We need to be careful that our curriculum doesn't misrepresent or create harmful assumptions about particular groups because of the way that they're represented in the curriculum as a whole, either through what we choose to teach or indeed what we choose not to teach. And pupils also need to learn about different historical fields of inquiry. This means ensuring that our curriculum doesn't focus narrowly on political history, for example, but that pupils learn about political, social, economic, and cultural developments in the past. Older pupils will also need to learn about a range of broader methodological approaches in history. For example, how cultural historians approach studying the past, in order to understand the complexity and diversity of history as a field of study. Now, it's clear from these that to ensure a broad curriculum, schools again need to consider their curriculum beyond the level of just the topics that are taught. They need to look at what is taught within topics to ensure that the curriculum as a whole is broad and ambitious for all pupils. The second important rationale for content choices in history is to develop readiness for what pupils will go on to learn. In an ambitious curriculum, we're going to want pupils to learn about the past in increasing richness and complexity as they move through their history education. We need to prepare them for that increasing complexity by securing knowledge which will be particularly helpful for making sense of what they're going to go on to learn. If we think about the complexity of a period such as the Reformation in Europe and what we might want pupils to know and understand about this, we can see just how complex the information that we need pupils to make sense of is. But even at a basic level, when we introduce the Reformation to pupils, we might say something apparently simple like this: the Reformation was a split in the church. Now imagine a pupil whose mental model for church looked something like this. They know that a church is a religious building. They know that it is very important to people, but they're clearly not ready for what we need them to learn here. This is the situation for too many pupils. They fail to grasp what we are teaching them because they lack the knowledge they need to make sense of the complexity. What pupils actually need to know by this stage to really make sense of what we mean when we say the Reformation was a split in the church is something like this. Now, it's worth noting they don't need to know or use the word institution, but they do need to know that we're not talking about a building here, but that we are talking about an institution. They need to understand the church as this complex network across Europe with shared ideas, even if they don't use the term institution in itself. Only then can they understand what we mean when we tell them that the Reformation was a split in the church. So how do we go about developing pupils' knowledge of something as complex as this, the idea of the church as an institution, so that they're ready to make sense of the Reformation? Very often, it's pupils' knowledge of terms or concepts like church, or deeper phenomena like how ideas spread or how rulers rule, which makes the difference in their ability to make sense of complex information. There are a couple of important points to consider when thinking about how the curriculum can build up pupils' knowledge to allow them to access more complex information like this. How we can build up their knowledge of terms and concepts like church so that they have the right level of complexity and security in those at the right points to allow them to access what we are teaching them in history. The first point is that pupils need to learn these terms and concepts through repeated encounters. They need to come up against these concepts often in the curriculum. The first reason for that is that repeated encounters make pupils' knowledge of these concepts more secure over time. They become more able to quickly recognize and make sense of these when they encounter them. But the second is also that this is the only way to allow pupils to build up more complex schema over time for these terms and concepts. Imagine a pupil who's got very limited knowledge of what a church is and now needs to understand that the church is an institution. This is far too big a leap for a pupil in order to assimilate this new information if they don't have a clear understanding of some other aspects of the church. Instead, what we do is across topics and years, make sure that pupils encounter these concepts again and again, and each time develop richer schema, a richer network of knowledge for these terms and concepts. For example, we might build on pupils' basic understanding of a church to then introduce some more complex ideas, like that there are networks of churches across medieval Europe, or that churches shared ideas with each other across this network, but also that they might have disagreements. These extra ideas related to the church help pupils to understand what it means to say that the church is an institution, the idea of a network and the idea of shared ideas. Now, importantly in history, there isn't always a right sequence to develop this knowledge in. Lots of aspects of this could be learned in different orders. Pupils could feasibly learn about networks of churches before or after learning about them having shared ideas. However, it probably would make sense that pupils learn about how important religion was to people in the medieval period before they learn about people debating religious ideas. Now, crucially in history, what makes a curriculum well sequenced isn't that pupils learn about particular aspects of this concept in a particular order, or indeed that topics are presented in a particular order, but rather that they build up enough knowledge of the concept to access what they're being taught at each stage in the curriculum. What we're really saying there is that sequencing is all about readiness, about pupils knowing what they need to know to make sense of what they're going to go on to learn. The second important point to consider when thinking about how we can build pupils' knowledge of terms and concepts to support them in understanding greater complexity is that as well as building these up through repeated encounters over time, pupils also need to learn these terms and concepts through meaningful examples. When pupils first encounter these ideas about the church, they're often too abstract to make any sense to pupils. We can't, for example, simply tell pupils that religion was important to people in the medieval period. It's far too abstract an idea, but we can show them this through meaningful examples. For example, images of Anglo-Saxon churches, descriptions of their scale and decoration, or descriptions of Anglo-Saxon burials with Christian artifacts. These meaningful examples of people choosing to be buried with specific objects or designing buildings in a particular way help pupils to make sense of this abstract idea that religion was important to people in the period. And then later, pupils might encounter the term church again, but this time with a focus on developing their knowledge of these more complex aspects of the church as a network of churches with shared ideas and disagreements. Pupils would need to be secure in that previous knowledge of the importance of religion and what a church is to understand an idea like networks of churches. But even with this knowledge about what a church is and how important they were, we still couldn't simply introduce the abstract idea of networks of churches to pupils. Instead, we might teach them about the Synod of Whitby, a 7th century meeting that was convened to decide the date for Easter to be used in the English Church. This is a meaningful example, all of the richness and colour and detail that pupils encounter when they hear about people travelling from across networks of churches or debating a specific but meaningful issue within the church, helps pupils to learn these complex and more abstract ideas, which in turn helps to build up their mental model of what the church means towards knowing about the church as an institution, therefore supporting what they're going to go on to learn. It's important to make the point here that history teachers and leaders are often having to balance this careful emphasis on really, really important knowledge that will help pupils access the later curriculum with the importance of the richness, the context of what they are learning. All of this other information that might come in the form of a story about the Synod of Whitby is not just useless and irrelevant detail. In fact, it's incredibly important to pupils learning the core knowledge that we want them to learn. This context is often described as the hinterland. It's the information surrounding the core knowledge which helps it make sense. Not only does it make abstract ideas more familiar or meaningful, as we've just discussed, it also helps to connect material into coherent narratives. It shows the connection between things. It shows how developments happened. It also gives pupils an opportunity for early encounters with future concepts. Any schools that teach the Norman Conquest for GCSE, for example, might be thankful later for pupils having come across even just once lightly the term synod when they have studied history in the past. And finally, often this context, the richness, the story is one of our best ways of ensuring that we can broaden the curriculum and explore complexity and diversity. So this context, this hinterland is really, really important. It's why pupils can't simply learn disconnected facts or definitions of key terms or abstract ideas. They need meaningful examples. But at the same time, we know it's important that teachers do focus on emphasising the most important content and concepts which will build readiness for future learning. This might be explicit. It might be through simple things like teachers' use of voice, where they pause, what they return to, what they choose to assess. But we know that teachers having a clear idea of the importance of this hinterland, but also of the need to emphasize and prioritize particular aspects within topics is the best way of helping pupils through this journey of securing more knowledge and richer knowledge to help them access greater complexity in the future. To come back to that idea of curriculum intent that we started with, our thinking about readiness, making sure pupils are ready for what they're going to go on to learn, might then lead us to identify specific knowledge we wanted pupils to develop through our topic on the Anglo-Saxons. It matches what we've just spoken about, the idea that there were networks of churches and that people across the church had shared ideas, but also disagreements. This knowledge is also part of our curriculum intent. It's part of the journey we've laid out for pupils to learn about the past in greater complexity and richness over time. We want to build their knowledge of the church to make sure that they are ready for what they're going on to learn. We're using that important rationale of building readiness. We also might want to emphasise the role of Hilda of Whitby, for example, in this topic, to ensure the breadth of our curriculum and ensure that the curriculum doesn't misrepresent the role and status of medieval women, for example. But we've got a rationale for what we intend pupils to learn right down at the level of topics, which is our curriculum intent. To finish this session, I'm going to talk briefly about disciplinary knowledge. Disciplinary knowledge is not a term that schools need to use or that we expect schools to be using, but it's one way of describing knowledge of how historians study the past and construct their accounts and arguments. An ambitious curriculum will also seek to teach pupils about this, and, as with their knowledge about the past, build pupils up to increasing complexity and richness in their knowledge about how historians study the past. Ultimately, this disciplinary knowledge is a key part of what will enable pupils to construct their own historical accounts and arguments. But for younger pupils, it's also useful to think about the longer journey of building them up to this knowledge over time. As with other complex ideas which we want pupils to know, like church, for example, we can identify meaningful examples throughout our curriculum and give pupils repeated encounters with these over time to build up their knowledge of complex disciplinary ideas, such as how historians use sources to study the past or how historians analyze causes. These meaningful examples, so examples of how historians have actually studied specific aspects of the past and constructed their accounts, ensure that we represent the discipline of history accurately in the classroom. Doing history is a complex process and it can't be boiled down to simple sentence starters or tips and tricks. Pupils need to learn about the actual processes by which historians construct accounts of the past. It's also important to note the interplay here between pupils' knowledge of the past and their knowledge of how historians study the past, if we want them to be able to construct their own historical arguments in time. To be able to do this, pupils will require really detailed knowledge of specific topics that they might be arguing or writing about, as well as complex and accurate knowledge of how historians approach historical questions to be able to bring these together in order to construct arguments which are meaningful. Now, if we think about the disciplinary knowledge that pupils need to know over time, it's similar to the complexities that we experience when we are teaching pupils difficult ideas like the church as an institution. Ultimately, to be able to really construct their own arguments and accounts, pupils will need to understand very clearly the complex ways in which historians study the past. That means they need to go far beyond simply understanding what sources are or that historians use sources to find out about the past, but actually need to understand this idea that historians construct accounts and arguments, that historians have complex relationships with source material, that they might have different research interests that affects the sources they use, that historians might disagree about how a source should be interpreted or the weight it should be given in making a particular claim. These are really complex and difficult ideas, but the same principles apply. Through repeated encounters with meaningful examples, pupils can build up their knowledge over time of how historians use sources, which will build towards them being able to understand how historians construct arguments and accounts, and ultimately that overall ambition for pupils to be able to construct their own arguments and accounts in meaningful ways. What this might look like, however, is starting really slowly in building up pupils' knowledge as a journey over time. So in year 3, for example, pupils might learn about Egypt, pharaonic Egypt, and they might learn through this some really simple knowledge about how historians use sources to start to build their mental model of what sources are and what history is. It could be through some nice specific examples of how historians have studied sources to reconstruct life in ancient Egypt. Through this, they might therefore develop knowledge of what sources are. They also might develop knowledge of this simple idea that historians use sources to find out about the past, which is an idea that will need to be made much more complex over time. We'll talk a little bit about early years in the subsequent session on primary, but it's important to note that everything that has happened for children from the early years up through Key Stage 1 and on will also have prepared them for this. Most importantly, by building pupils' mental model of the past, so that when we talk about sources being things from the past, they understand what this is. Pupils need to know what the past is to be able to make sense of what a source is. And so this journey does start in the early years even though we're not teaching history as a discrete subject, and we're certainly not teaching disciplinary knowledge. But what we are doing is building children's knowledge to help them access what they're going to go on to learn. Again, it's all about readiness. What we might then do, again, following that principle of meaningful examples and repeated encounters with complex ideas, is to come back to sources again in a later topic, and this time develop more complex ideas for pupils. If they already understand that historians use sources to find out about the past, they're well prepared to learn about the idea that there are different types of sources, such as written or archaeological sources, and perhaps even to learn that there are different kinds of sources that can answer different kinds of questions. Now, again, these ideas are very abstract. We wouldn't introduce them to pupils in this form. We would use meaningful examples in order to show pupils what we mean. For example, how historians might have used evidence from coins to investigate links between Saxon kingdoms and other places in Europe, or how they might use monastic records to investigate particular developments in the period. In all of these examples, it's important to note that the knowledge of the past and this knowledge of sources is carefully intertwined. To understand how historians use sources to answer particular questions about the past, pupils need to know about the Anglo-Saxon period to make sense of the way that historians have used sources to construct particular understandings about that period. So they can't learn about sources in isolation. They need to learn them through the context of particular periods, particular questions that historians have asked. And over time, throughout the curriculum, building up through to Key Stage 3, pupils will build increasingly sophisticated mental models for ideas like how historians use sources. And that is what will allow them to ultimately use the same approaches and patterns and conventions to construct their own sophisticated and meaningful historical arguments and accounts. And so to return to curriculum intent one more time, we might also, in our curriculum intent, include specific disciplinary knowledge, which can be taught through our Anglo-Saxon topic. For example, that there are different types of sources, or that they can be used to answer different types of questions about the past. Again, all of this, the knowledge of the past that we want pupils to develop, the knowledge of how historians study the past that we want them to develop, is all part of our curriculum intent. It's what we want pupils to know to ensure that firstly, they learn a broad curriculum, and secondly, that they're developing knowledge which will make them ready for what they will go on to learn. Just a few key takeaways from this session. First of all, it's useful for teachers in a school to have a shared understanding of what pupils need to know. Ofsted doesn't expect to see curriculum planning or documentation in any particular form, but we know it is important that teachers are clear about what is the core knowledge that pupils need to learn through particular topics. These plans need to go beyond a simple list of topics and include specific aspects within those. This requires leaders and teachers to be making decisions about what content to emphasize. And this is often based on those important rationales of ensuring the breadth of the curriculum and also securing important knowledge for what pupils will go on to learn in the future. We know it's important that teachers and leaders balance the importance of this core knowledge and securing it for all pupils with also ensuring a rich hinterland, ensuring that pupils study the past with richness and complexity and detail and context. We know that knowledge of terms and concepts can be one important way of securing pupils' ability to make sense of more complex information in the future. And that knowledge of these complex terms and concepts is best built up over time through repeated encounters with meaningful examples. And finally, we looked at how disciplinary knowledge should also be planned to be built up over time through meaningful and authentic examples. In this second session of the video, we'll consider how the principles of curriculum in history, which we explored in the first section, might affect our choices relating to pedagogy and assessment in history. In that session, we talked about the importance of having a clear curriculum intent, specific knowledge that we wanted pupils to develop, things we want them to be able to do, both in terms of knowledge of the past and knowledge of what historians do when they study the past and construct their accounts. Now, it's important to say that all decisions about pedagogy and assessment flow from this curriculum intent. Only by deciding what it is we want pupils to know can we make the right choices about how we teach that content to pupils, and also what we're going to assess to check whether pupils know and have understood what it is we want to teach them. With that in mind, there are some broad principles that can be applied to the pedagogy that is selected in history, and also the way in which we can approach assessment, which I'll explore briefly now. First of all, as we've shared in the research review, a point which is well understood by history teachers but is worth revisiting is that it's crucial that teachers emphasize important content and concepts that we want pupils to know. This makes these more likely to be remembered by pupils. Now, this could be through specific activity choices. For example, pupils annotating a map or a timeline with events in the Roman invasion of Britain will draw pupils' attention to the stages of that invasion, which means that pupils are more likely to be focused on that aspect of the topic and learn and remember more about the way the invasion developed over time. So if this is part of the crucial knowledge which our curriculum identifies for pupils to know, then that would be a really effective activity choice. However, the same activity choice could be less effective if what pupils are focused on is not the important content we want them to know. For example, if they're focusing on what colours to use to colour in part of their timeline. When using a map, for example, it could be a perfect opportunity to revisit pupils' knowledge of compass directions or vocabulary learned through geography. But teachers should also be aware that focusing too heavily on this at the expense of the history content makes pupils less likely to remember the details of the Roman invasion, which we also want to teach them. As I mentioned earlier, this emphasis doesn't only come from explicit activity choices. Teachers can also emphasize particular content and concepts through the time they spend explaining them, the way they use their voice, the use of displays or teaching resources, what they focus on in discussions and questionings, etc. This is one reason why having a clear shared understanding of what pupils need to know can be so powerful, because it supports all teachers in making these continuous micro decisions about what to emphasize during their teaching, helping pupils to learn the most important knowledge identified by the curriculum. Pupils are also more likely to remember what they've thought analytically about. If pupils are simply annotating a timeline by copying down information from the board, then they're unlikely to be engaging analytically with that information. However, if pupils are, for example, identifying key turning points in a series of developments or explaining links between two events, then this analytical thinking also makes them more likely to learn well what they are being taught about. The second point is that important terms and concepts can be practiced and used in multiple contexts to build pupils' fluency with these, just like we might practice elements in other subjects. For example, teachers might regularly and revisit and encourage pupils to practice their use of the term invasion. With enough practice, pupils can build fluent recall and recognition of these terms so that they'll more quickly make sense of new information when they encounter these. Or a new topic might require pupils to be very fluent with a particular term. For example, if pupils learn about the dispute between Henry and Becket, they might encounter the term papal or papacy or pope frequently. Pupils' prior knowledge might help them to make sense of these terms with some working, but to be able to really read texts or listen to explanations or narratives about this period, pupils might need to be able to make sense automatically and without effort of a term like papal. So one way of doing this would be to give pupils lots of opportunities to practice the term and to revisit it in advance so that they're able to recognise it. It's worth saying, however, that practice in history doesn't just mean learning a word in isolation. We also encourage practice when we revisit, when we reuse these terms in contexts. And most often, the best way of pupils learning new vocabulary and terms and concepts is through meaningful examples. Another general point that can support pedagogical decisions in history is understanding the importance of the historical context, because being secure in this, or having what we might describe as a sense of period, can help pupils to learn material more readily. Knowledge of the broader features of periods makes new information about the same period more accessible, and a sense of period can act as a sort of effective hook for new knowledge. For example, if pupils have a knowledge of the Roman world and how people travelled, the kind of settlements they lived in, then this can help them to learn more easily and securely about specific events in this period. Teachers can use a range of materials, including visuals and maps and rich description, to help pupils develop that sense of period. And the final aspect of effective pedagogy in history is understanding the power of stories and narratives. These help us make sense of complex information. Stories have got familiar features and structures which help us make sense of the links between events and developments, or understand things in greater depth and complexity. It's worth saying that narratives aren't straightforward in history, and it's important that pupils ultimately learn about how historical narratives are constructed. But while keeping this in mind, narratives are also often the best way of introducing new information to pupils. Places, societies, events, developments can all be introduced through rich stories. That might include individual stories and experiences, which can illuminate bigger developments, or narratives of events, which help people to see the connection between these, extracts from historical fiction, or even, when carefully designed, the use of well-researched, imagined characters to help pupils understand people's experience of change, for example. And moving on to assessment. The principles which underpin effective assessment are the same in history as in other subjects, but sometimes realizing them on the ground can be complicated. It's important to be really clear that, just like with pedagogical choices, making sure that our activities are led by our curriculum intent, that we focus on the most important content and concepts. It's also important that we focus our assessment on the important knowledge that pupils need as identified in the curriculum. That is likely to include that knowledge that we've identified as helping to build readiness for what pupils are going to go on to learn. Secondly, assessment must help teachers to identify specific knowledge gaps or misconceptions which pupils have. Again, just like we would in other subjects, it's important that we identify these gaps early so that we can address these in teaching, or if they're more widespread, in our curriculum planning. Now, one of the complexities in history is getting at what the gaps or misconceptions are that pupils have. Sometimes we can make this even more difficult when we primarily assess pupils through pieces of writing or extended answers. These are incredibly useful tools and they can be used as forms of assessment, but they require significant skill on the part of teachers and leaders to unpick what teachers can infer from a pupil's writing. Extended writing is also an incredibly important activity in history for pupils of all ages, and pupils need lots of opportunities to be able to consolidate their understanding and write about what they've learned about the past. However, as the primary form of assessment, extended writing doesn't always give us the most useful information about what pupils know and don't know. If we look at this example of a pupil's answer to the question, what was it like to live in the Roman Empire? They said the Romans had a big army and they fought against all of the other countries. They took off them. People didn't like the wars. They are rich. On the other hand, the Romans also had colosseums and people liked that. They made the people better because they were Romans. Now we can see some of the pupils' knowledge of what they've learned in the Romans topic coming through in that piece of writing. But it also seems that there are some gaps and misconceptions for this pupil, but it's really quite hard to identify precisely what they might be in this case. That's because this task is requiring pupils to use lots of different knowledge and skills at the same time. So we're seeing the result of that complex combination of all of those things in what they write. So it's very hard to identify with precision exactly what it is that a pupil doesn't know when they don't perform as well as we might like. We might get a sense that the answer isn't as good as it could be, but we're less likely to get a clear understanding of what it is this pupil hasn't learned securely when we taught them about the Romans, or that they maybe haven't learned securely when we taught them about previous topics. With these extended writing as a form of assessment, we're also much more likely to get distracted by other things such as spelling and grammar, or the use of particular writing structures, or more superficial features of the writing, like the way that pupils have laid out it into paragraphs. Again, it's perfectly appropriate for pupils to complete extended writing for us to give feedback about spelling and grammar, but we also need assessment in history, which identifies specific gaps in historical knowledge or historical misconceptions which pupils might have. We see similar issues with assessment through skills ladders, or where assessment focuses on outcomes which are too broad or too high level. Just like with a piece of extended writing, if we try and assess everything at once, we often miss specific gaps and misconceptions which pupils have. Now, as we discussed in the first session, our overall curriculum aims, our ambition for pupils at the end of study with us, is likely to include the high level goal of pupils writing their own historical arguments. And that will involve them having lots of practice of extended writing for all pupils. But it does also require pupils to build up specific knowledge of the topics that they're studying and of how historians study the past and construct arguments as well. And it's usually gaps in these building blocks that we need to identify early in order to address them quickly. So the problem with broad writing tasks, or with skills ladders or broad descriptors like these to assess pupils against, is that they draw our focus away from the very specific aspects of the curriculum which we need all pupils to secure now in order to be able to do these more complex things successfully in the future. At this point, at the end of the Romans topic, for example, pupils might need to secure their knowledge about the Romans, some particular features of the period, their knowledge of important terms and concepts that we've identified in our curriculum plans. The pupils who don't will develop gaps, which might mean they're not able to make sense of complex material at later stages in the curriculum, and therefore ultimately don't go on to reach those high-level outcomes of writing really powerful and meaningful historical arguments of their own. At this stage, assessment is likely to be most effective when it focuses on and identifies gaps in this specific knowledge that pupils need to know at this point. Instead, feedback based upon skills ladders can sometimes not help pupils to address gaps in their knowledge. And in the worst cases, it can actually create or even reinforce misconceptions. For example, if a pupil was given feedback to improve their work by giving 2 pieces of evidence to support each point, then this actually might create misconceptions about historical arguments and evidence, i.e. that an argument is stronger if it's got quantitatively more evidence supporting it. The other danger is that pupils' work might be skewed to meet these broad criteria, which actually are quite easy for pupils to perform without necessarily developing the underlying knowledge that we actually want as the outcome for the sequence of lesson. For example, pupils might use key terms they don't really understand, or write a conclusion which isn't really an argument, or pepper their writing with random facts to support points, but not actually know, for example, how Rome was governed. Without a clear curriculum and a clear understanding of what pupils need to know, it's unlikely that teacher assessment will focus on the right things. In primary schools, non-specialist teachers would benefit from really clear guidance on what pupils need to know, so they can use their skill in assessing pupils to identify specific gaps and misconceptions. Otherwise, there's a danger that teachers might default to the kind of surface features of pupils' work and therefore make incorrect assumptions about progress. We sometimes see mark books for other subjects, such as mathematics, where teachers have identified individual pupils with specific gaps or misconceptions, such as their knowledge of number bonds, but where in history, pupils' knowledge is not unpicked with the same level of clarity or precision. For a similar reason, as identified with using these broad skills ladders, GCSE style questions are unlikely to be a helpful way of assessing pupils at Key Stage 3. As well as the danger that focusing too much on the GCSE assessments narrows the curriculum content at Key Stage 3, for example, by encouraging teachers to reduce teaching about sources and evidence down to how to approach a GCSE source question. They also make it hard to identify specific gaps or misconceptions in pupils' historical knowledge. Remember that GCSE questions are designed to be a summative assessment of what pupils know at the end of Key Stage 4. They're not designed to be used formatively. Again, they're big outcome tasks that require pupils to draw on a large body of knowledge and skills, and therefore make it hard to identify specific gaps or misconceptions which pupils have. So if our curriculum identifies specific knowledge we want pupils to know, then it can actually be relatively simple to check whether pupils know and remember this content. We can do this through a range of approaches, such as low stakes quizzing or multiple choice questions. We can design these to focus on specific knowledge, for example, whether pupils know what an invasion is, and then can inform ourselves about whether all pupils know this or not, and then address gaps or misconceptions as they arise. It's important to note that relatively simple assessment tools can also help us assess more complex ideas. Although no assessment is perfect and always requires some level of inference from the teachers, we can, for example, ask pupils who are about to study the Norman conquest of England, who've learned about the Battle of Hastings, a question like, after William won the Battle of Hastings, what else would he need to do to take control of England? And through this, we can start to get an idea of what pupils know about the complex processes of a ruler establishing power in a new territory, or what it means for a ruler to be legitimate or accepted by the people that they rule over. Another advantage of these types of assessment is that they don't require extensive bookmarking in the way that extended writing does. It's easy for a teacher, for example, to circulate the classroom as pupils answer some simple questions and identify gaps and misconceptions and address them there and then with individuals or a whole class without having to drag home sets of books. So some key takeaways relating to pedagogy and assessment. Firstly, teaching can help pupils to learn new information best when it focuses on important content and concepts that we've identified in our curriculum. Secondly, that narrative, stories, and a sense of period can help make information more meaningful for pupils in history. And thirdly, assessment needs to be focused on identifying specific gaps and misconceptions in pupils' historical knowledge so that these can be addressed. In this third and final session, we'll just quickly look at some of the insights that we have shared in previous sessions and think about how these might be implemented in primary and secondary schools. The first thing to say is that if your setting has early years provision, then this is the start of children's journey through the history curriculum. Although they won't learn history as a discrete subject, effective curriculums are co-produced by staff from across the whole school. It's crucial that leaders attend carefully to the knowledge that children acquire in the early years, because it's this that will form the bedrock of everything to come and allow them to make sense of the curriculum as they move forward. Again, a key focus is on building children's readiness for what they'll go on to learn. Weak curriculums are often characterized by thinking that doesn't take adequate account of the early years, so we must start there. What we can do with the early years is to think about particular terms and concepts we might want children to develop knowledge of early on in their journey. The early learning goals give us broad aims, but again, aren't a curriculum in and of themselves. For example, when we think about an early learning goal like talk about the lives of people around them and their roles in society, we as a setting can choose what we want children to learn within that broad aim. We can choose through the stories we read, the way we support play, the physical environment we set up, what we choose to talk to children about, to emphasize particular terms and concepts with an eye on what children will go on to learn. For example, we know that pupils at the start of Key Stage 2 will learn about the development of early civilizations. One aspect of this will be learning about the development of agriculture and its impact upon the development of human settlements. If pupils come to this Key Stage 2 topic with no knowledge of agriculture, then we need to spend much of the time of this topic teaching them about agriculture before they can begin to learn about how and why humans settled in the Fertile Crescent, for example. However, if pupils have some knowledge of agriculture, how humans can grow crops to feed large numbers of people, for example, then they can develop more richer and more secure knowledge of the specific historical conditions and developments in the period. So when we think about what roles in society we might want to introduce to children in the early years, we might think about how building children's knowledge of farming and crops might be particularly useful to support them in learning the later curriculum. We could aim for children in the early years to know what a farm is, that people can plant and grow crops, maybe that crops grow better in certain conditions or that crops can feed people. This is not just knowledge that's useful for history, of course, but has broad use for children as they move through the curriculum. If we're clear in working with our early years staff to emphasize the particular core knowledge that we might want children to develop in the early years, then they can look for opportunities to develop this knowledge using their skill as practitioners. They might select and read books to children which talk about farming, for example, or about people growing their own food. They might talk about farming or planting when teaching children about the natural world or about the seasons. They might find opportunities to introduce farming to children as part of their play, or find opportunities to talk to children about farming. In Key Stage 1, teachers can then build on this early knowledge of farming to move pupils on to understand more about agriculture and how it works in readiness for what they will eventually go on to learn about early civilizations. So it's crucial that we think about what children might learn in reception that will help them to learn history in the future, particularly what terms or concepts might be useful for pupils as they move through the curriculum. And also, as we mentioned in session 2, at all ages, including for the youngest children, the power of story and narrative can be exploited to support children's learning. In the youngest years, non-historical stories such as fairy tales can build really powerful knowledge for future learning in history from a very young age. And as children get older, real stories from the past, carefully selected, can also be used very successfully to introduce new ideas and words to young children. Now let's look at one more example of developing a particular concept in the primary phase. Earlier, we looked at how we might use meaningful examples to develop pupils' knowledge of a concept like the church. If we take one other example of a complex concept, again, it isn't a word that we would expect pupils to know or use itself, but the idea of legitimacy, of rulers appearing to be the rightful ruler of a place, is hugely important. Without building some knowledge of this, pupils can't make sense of rulers and how they rule. They can't make sense of how new rulers establish themselves. For example, how William established himself as the King of England after the Norman Conquest. And they also can't make sense of how people challenge rule, for example, through protests. As we covered in the first session, to develop knowledge of a complex concept like this requires repeated encounters with meaningful examples. One meaningful example we might use to begin building pupils' knowledge of this idea of legitimacy could come from the succession of Caesar Augustus. When we focus on readiness for future learning, this appears as one aspect of the Roman period which might be particularly powerful in preparing pupils for much of what they'll go on to learn. But again, we use concrete aspects of this, such as how Augustus used statues to project a particular image, or how he used religious ideas to support his power, to help pupils build their concepts of how rulers present themselves as legitimate. Again, what we're doing is being clear about what is being emphasized. So we want pupils to learn about the richness and detail, to see examples of statues, to hear stories and understand events from the period. But we also want teachers to focus on this core knowledge, developing pupils' knowledge of how and why rulers have to present themselves to people as legitimate. And again, to take on what we said earlier, that curriculum intent then informs our decisions around pedagogy and assessment. So if we're clear that we want to build pupils' knowledge about legitimacy, then we can make choices to ensure that we teach that effectively. This means us leading with our curriculum intent, teaching this idea of legitimacy, not leading with the pedagogy or with particular activities that we want to do. We might have a range of lovely activities, such as pupils designing their own statues of Augustus, but we need to think carefully about the most effective way of teaching pupils the content we want them to know. Designing a statue of Augustus might work well as a way of consolidating pupils' knowledge about how statues were used, but it also may not cover other important ways that Augustus secured his rule. Instead, we might choose a main teaching activity focusing on the story of how Augustus secured his rule, covering a broader range of ideas. We might still do something similar, perhaps giving pupils an image of a statue of Augustus to label, to secure their knowledge of some of the particular images that Augustus was trying to present, by using statues as a way of making that concrete for pupils. But the most important thing is that we don't want our lesson to be led by the activity. We want it to be led by the content which we want pupils to know. There are a range of different ways that we could choose to teach this content. There is no right pedagogy, but we just need to make sure that our approach is an effective way of teaching pupils all of the knowledge that we want them to learn about a particular topic. We also, to increase pupils' focus on the key knowledge we want them to learn, might draw pupils' attention to this issue of legitimacy immediately and give them that as a framing for what they'll go on to learn. For example, instead of a broad question like, how did Augustus become emperor? We might use a question like, how did Augustus make himself seem like the right ruler for Rome? Which gives us a clearer focus on this idea of legitimacy. We might think about what we want to do just before pupils learn this new information. We might prepare pupils for this by starting a lesson with a recap of Julius Caesar's rule, for example, with a particular emphasis on this idea of how Julius Caesar made himself appear to be a rightful ruler. Also, this context of Caesar's rule and death is crucial to the story of Augustus's succession. So we're also warming up pupils' knowledge of this context. We're also warming up their knowledge of the broader period and features of Rome and Roman politics. We're recapping important concepts like emperor or popularity. Particularly for younger pupils, it might be really useful to support their thinking with a framework. So we might suggest, for example, 3 key ways that emperors secured their rule from the story of Julius Caesar, such as popularity with ordinary Romans, religion, and military power. What we've got hidden behind this teaching are these complex concepts of legitimacy and how rulers project a particular image. Because these are so complex and central to the lesson, we might make the pedagogical choice to really slow down to emphasize these, perhaps by really taking our time to study a contemporary statue of Augustus and really unpicking the image that it's intended to project. And because pupils learn best when they engage analytically with content, we might tell pupils some parts of the story of Augustus's first years in power, and perhaps ask them to identify examples of those ideas that we previously identified, such as how Augustus used religion, popularity, or military success to secure his rule. Now, it's worth adding a note of caution here about the use of the term ambitious when we think about what we're doing in our curriculum. It can be tempting for us to try and be ambitious for pupils by wanting them to show higher order thinking, by getting them to make a judgment in relation to a complex question like this one, which reason was most important in securing Augustus's rule. However, there is a lot of complex content for pupils to learn in this lesson on Augustus. It's ambitious enough to get every pupil to know about the different ways that Augustus secured his rule, and in the background be building pupils' knowledge of concepts like legitimacy. These are incredibly powerful in pupils' future learning about government and rule, and will ultimately support them in doing some very sophisticated analysis of their own. But at this stage, it's unlikely that pupils know enough to make this judgment in a meaningful way because we haven't actually given them much information about how successful these measures were. And so their judgments are likely to be largely guesswork. This might distract them from the learning that we want them to focus on, but also could build misconceptions about coming to historical judgments. With assessment, rather than using a large outcome task like an answer to that question on the previous slide, it might be better to check pupils' understanding of just some of the key points that we've taught them. For example, we might check their knowledge with some simple questions. There are other things we might want to do to check other aspects, such as the chronological knowledge we've taught pupils, their understanding of the period. But these questions would be one way, among many, of getting at some idea of what pupils know and have understood from the content that we've taught them. Importantly, they're useful because they focus on the most important content and concepts which we identify in our curriculum. And we could use similar questions in future to check whether pupils have secured this knowledge in the long term. And to recap what we said previously about disciplinary knowledge, it's important that we're careful about what our aims are in terms of what pupils learn about how historians study the past and construct their accounts. For example, if we gave pupils a picture of a source of Augustus and said, how useful is this source about Augustus? This might be a well-meaning attempt to teach pupils some disciplinary knowledge about sources, but it also has the potential to result in misconceptions. Most obviously, it might reinforce the misconception that sources have an inherent usefulness or reliability. Instead, certain sources are more or less useful for answering particular types of questions. Historians do study individual sources, but they study these against the backdrop of lots of other sources which they consider. And so dealing with a source in isolation can sometimes be problematic. And pupils are also unlikely to know enough at this stage about how historians use sources to answer a question like this in a meaningful way. Instead, as we considered in the earlier session, it's important to see building disciplinary knowledge as a journey. We might end this lesson by thinking about the natural next question about Augustus's attempt to secure his power. Did it work? And we could explain to pupils that it's actually really hard to know whether Augustus was successful in appearing legitimate to all people in Rome because of the kinds of sources that we have from the period and some of the gaps in those sources. We could describe some of the specific source material available and what it can tell us. Doing this would build really powerful knowledge about sources, which pupils will be able to go on to use to make sense of sources themselves in future, and ultimately to make their own sophisticated analytical judgments from sources. So, as we've explored already, emphasizing in particularly important concepts and content is really important. It's really useful, particularly in primary schools where we might have a number of non-specialists teaching, that we share a clear understanding of what it is that pupils need to know as a result of particular lessons, topics, or sequencing. But also that we don't just boil down our curriculum to simply those elements, but we encourage teachers to ensure that pupils learn about history with all of the richness and complexity. That in primary history, teaching and assessment focuses clearly on what's been identified as the most important knowledge in our plans for the curriculum, and that we're really careful, particularly with younger pupils, to build up their knowledge of complex disciplinary ideas over time and through meaningful and authentic examples. Finally, just a brief note on disciplinary knowledge in secondary history. To reiterate what we said earlier, it's really important to be clear about what it means for pupils to get better in history when we think about the last stage in some pupils' journey through the history curriculum. It means pupils getting better by building their knowledge and understanding of the past, what is sometimes called substantive knowledge, for example, the events preceding the outbreak of World War I, and their disciplinary knowledge, their knowledge of how historians study the past and construct accounts. For example, how historians have analysed the causes of World War I. As we've discussed, these categories are closely interlinked. Pupils can't learn disciplinary knowledge in isolation without a specific context. In order to be able to understand how historians have analysed the causes of World War I, and particularly in order to construct their own arguments or accounts about the causes of World War I, pupils need really detailed and secure substantive knowledge of the events themselves. Ultimately, it's this rich and authentic knowledge of how historians study the past and construct their accounts, which is going to be an important component of pupils being able to construct their own accounts and arguments. This knowledge goes far beyond just knowing sentence starters or writing structures, but includes complex knowledge of how historians approach the past, developed through repeated encounters with meaningful examples of historical practice. But in this specific example, to be able to succeed in this complex, broad task like writing an essay or a historical argument on the causes of World War I, as well as this knowledge of how historians approach questions of causation, pupils will also need rich and secure understanding of the context of the causes and the events leading up to World War I. Now, if we even start to try and identify some of the things that pupils need to know securely to be able to themselves analyse the causes of World War I, it becomes clear very quickly the range and the depth and the complexity of knowledge that pupils need. What this does is emphasise just in how important the journey is of building up pupils' knowledge, including their knowledge of some of these underlying concepts like empire or diplomacy, which sit behind some of the things they need to understand in this topic, so that when pupils are introduced to new ideas like Serbian nationalism, they can quickly grasp the very complex events and developments which lead up to World War I in particular, that in turn will allow them to develop secure knowledge of this context, which they can combine with their knowledge of historical argument to construct their own arguments shaped by their knowledge of the context and their knowledge of the discipline. Because of the importance of that underlying knowledge, it's important that even in secondary school, we also have tools for assessing pupils' knowledge at particular points so we can identify gaps and misconceptions. We can also assess pupils through essays, but we just need to be clear that assessing pupils' work in a complex task like an essay requires a careful understanding on the part of teachers about what they can and can't infer from what is written, because of the range of knowledge, both substantive and disciplinary knowledge, which pupils are drawing upon. And essays aren't always the most useful way of identifying specific gaps and misconceptions. So it's often very useful to balance these with other assessment tools that can focus on specific gaps and misconceptions in pupils' knowledge. Topic-specific mark schemes can also be really useful and used by many secondary departments skillfully to identify the ways in which knowledge might manifest itself in a pupil's extended writing on a specific topic. But again, applying a GCSE mark scheme to a piece of work like this is likely to distract from the complex interaction between these different layers of knowledge in what pupils write, and might again distort our feedback to focus on unhelpful surface features or even develop misconceptions for pupils. For example, if we give pupils feedback like make sure you have 2 separate paragraphs and a conclusion, then we aren't fundamentally directing them towards the features of quality historical argument or identifying specific gaps or misconceptions they might have about the events leading up to World War I. If pupils' arguments are narrow or not developed enough, this is likely to suggest a lack of knowledge of the events leading up to World War I, rather than a lack of knowledge of how to structure a piece of written work. So for this reason, it's useful to also have assessment that identifies specific knowledge gaps and misconceptions. These might be useful in helping to address knowledge gaps before pupils write an essay. They could consider, for example, whether pupils are secure in the sequence of events leading up to World War I, without which they won't be able to successfully analyse causes, or whether they've understood the priorities of the German High Command in 1914, a really important and complex idea that underpins some of the developments in the immediate preceding events before the war, or whether pupils understand the logistics required to prepare an army for war in this period, all of which are important components of understanding the causes of World War I and being able to write a really meaningful and powerful argument about this. So an ambitious curriculum will build up pupils' knowledge to that level of richness and complexity that allows them to write really meaningful and successful historical arguments, and alongside this build up their knowledge of the discipline and disciplinary traditions of history in ways that are really complex and authentic. Again, it's important to emphasize that pupils need to understand the authentic way in which historians, for example, work with sources. Things like the relationship between sources, evidence, and how historians construct their claims and arguments. It requires schools to build on what pupils have learned at Key Stage 2 to develop through meaningful examples an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how historians use sources. Again, this is not likely to be achieved if disciplinary knowledge at Key Stage 3 is treated as in line with GCSE assessments for a particular exam board. Remember that GCSE exams are a summative assessment of what pupils know by the end of Key Stage 4. They don't identify a curriculum for us to teach pupils these complex ideas about sources or other aspects of the discipline. If a curriculum at Key Stage 3 limits what pupils learn about sources to exam-style approaches, for example, identifying two features in a source or expanding on these from their own knowledge, then these alone won't prepare pupils with the rich knowledge they need to reach these ambitious endpoints of our curriculum, of having a secure and rich and complex knowledge of how historians study the past. And so, final takeaways from that session. To be successful in constructing their own arguments and accounts, pupils need secure and rich disciplinary knowledge of how historians study the past and construct their accounts. That requires ambitious curriculum plans that develop the complexity of pupils' knowledge of how historians study the past over time. Pupils also need rich and secure knowledge of the specific context that they might be writing or arguing about. And building that over time enables them to develop increasingly complex historical knowledge to support sophisticated historical arguments. My thanks for taking the time to watch the video, and also genuine thanks from me for all the work that you do to develop knowledgeable and passionate historians. Just to point you in the direction of some other resources, if you haven't seen, there is a research review published in History, which you can access by searching by the subject in your browser. There's no expectation on schools that this is read, but it does come with some helpful hyperlinked contents on the left of the web page. So you might want to look at particular sections if they're useful to you and the curriculum development process in your school. It also might be worth looking at our YouTube channel, which has a playlist of other subject webinars like this one, and also many more videos about our work here at Ofsted, including attempts to myth bust and prevent and address misconceptions about the inspection process. Again, thank you from me for all that you do in your school to support pupils, and I wish you the very best.